The automatic doors of St. Michael's Hospital slid open with a soft whoosh as a man shuffled inside, his clothes worn and patched at the elbows. Marcus Wellington, one of the wealthiest men in the country, adjusted the torn baseball cap on his head and pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. Nobody in this bustling emergency room had any idea they were looking at the hospital's actual owner. He had built this place from the ground up 15 years ago, but today he wasn't here as a benefactor or a businessman. Today he was here to see the truth. The truth about how his staff treated those who couldn't afford expensive care. The truth about whether the values he had instilled in this institution were actually being practiced. Marcus had received anonymous letters for months, complaints about mistreatment of poor patients, and he needed to see it with his own eyes. So he had left his penthouse, his tailored suits, and his luxury car behind. He had become invisible, just another face in the crowd of the struggling and the sick, and what he was about to witness would change everything. The waiting room was packed with people, some coughing, others holding ice packs to injuries, all wearing the same expression of exhausted resignation. Marcus found a seat in the corner, between an elderly woman knitting and a young mother trying to calm her crying baby. He watched as people approached the reception desk, some with insurance cards held hopefully, others with nothing but their pain. The receptionist, a young woman named Jennifer according to her name tag, barely looked up from her computer screen as she processed each person. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with mechanical efficiency, but her eyes held no warmth. Marcus noticed how her tone changed, depending on who stood before her. When a well-dressed businessman approached with his insurance information ready, she smiled brightly and expedited his paperwork. But when an older Hispanic man in work clothes stepped forward, speaking broken English and fumbling with crumpled bills from his pocket, her expression hardened. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his trained eye catching every detail of the interaction. This was exactly what the letters had described. "Do you have insurance?" Jennifer asked the worker, her voice flat and impatient. The man shook his head apologetically, explaining that he had been laid off from his construction job and his coverage had lapsed. He clutched his side, clearly in significant pain, and tried to explain that he thought he might have broken a rib. Jennifer sighed loudly enough for everyone in the waiting area to hear, then slid a clipboard across the counter with barely concealed disdain. "Fill this out. It'll be a long wait. We prioritize patients based on insurance status and severity." The man nodded gratefully, taking the clipboard with shaking hands, not realizing that what she had just told him violated the hospital's own policy. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he remained still, maintaining his disguise. He needed to see more. He needed to understand how deep this problem went. As the worker shuffled away to fill out his forms, Marcus noticed a well-dressed woman approach the desk. She didn't have an appointment, just a minor complaint about seasonal allergies. Within 5 minutes, she was escorted to an examination room. The construction worker, still clutching his ribs, had been waiting for over an hour. Marcus decided it was time to test the system himself. He stood up slowly, affecting a slight limp, and approached the reception desk. Jennifer looked up at him with the same cold assessment she had given the construction worker, her eyes scanning his worn clothing and weathered appearance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she'd rather be doing anything else. Marcus explained that he had been experiencing severe chest pains for the past 2 days and was worried it might be serious. He kept his voice humble, almost apologetic, the way he imagined someone without means might speak when asking for help they feared they couldn't afford. Jennifer's expression didn't change as she slid the same clipboard toward him. "Insurance card?" she asked, already knowing the answer. When Marcus shook his head and explained he didn't have insurance, that he was between jobs, she made a show of checking her watch. "Like I told the last guy, it's going to be a very long wait. Hours, probably. You might want to try the free clinic on 5th Street instead." Marcus felt a flash of anger, but he kept his composure. "I'm really worried about my chest," he said quietly. Could it be a heart issue? Jennifer shrugged, already turning back to her computer. You'll have to wait for a doctor to determine that. As Marcus took his clipboard and returned to the waiting area, he observed the dynamics of the emergency room with growing concern. The staff moved with practiced efficiency when dealing with certain patients, but that efficiency seemed to evaporate when treating others. A young doctor named Dr. Harrison, whose white coat was pristine and whose confidence bordered on arrogance, emerged from the examination area. He called out a name, and the well-dressed woman from earlier stood up eagerly. Marcus watched as Dr. Harrison greeted her with a warm smile, holding the door open for her like a gentleman showing a guest into his home. The contrast was stark and disturbing. 15 years ago, when Marcus had founded this hospital, he had stood in this very waiting room and made a promise. He had promised that every person who walked through these doors would receive the same level of care, regardless of their ability to pay. He had built a charitable fund specifically to cover costs for uninsured patients. He had hired staff who he believed shared his vision of compassionate, equitable healthcare. Now, sitting here in disguise, he was seeing how far the institution had drifted from those founding principles. The question was, how widespread was this problem? Was it just Jennifer and Dr. Harrison, or had the rot spread deeper? 2 hours passed, and Marcus remained in the waiting room, watching the parade of patients come and go. He noticed patterns that made his blood boil. Patients with insurance cards were seen within 30 to 45 minutes. Patients without insurance, or those who appeared to be from lower income backgrounds, waited for hours or were actively encouraged to seek care elsewhere. The elderly woman who had been knitting beside him finally got called back, and Marcus realized she had been waiting even longer than he had. When she stood up, she swayed slightly, clearly dizzy, and had to steady herself against the chair. Not a single staff member rushed to help her. She made her way slowly to the examination area, alone and struggling. Marcus wanted to jump up and help her, to reveal who he was, and demand better treatment for everyone in this room. But he held back. He needed to experience the full extent of the problem. Finally, after nearly 3 hours of waiting, his name was called. "Marcus Johnson," a nurse called out, reading from the clipboard he had filled out using a fake name. He stood up, still maintaining his limp, and followed her through the doors into the examination area. The nurse, whose name tag read Sandra, led Marcus down a hallway lined with examination rooms. Her demeanor was professional but distant, going through the motions without any real engagement. She showed him into a small room and handed him a gown, instructing him to change and wait for the doctor. The room was cold, sterile, and impersonal, nothing like the warm, welcoming spaces Marcus had envisioned when designing this wing of the hospital. He changed into the gown and sat on the examination table, the paper crinkling beneath him. The walls were bare, except for a poster about hand-washing and a chart showing proper posture. He remembered approving the budget for artwork in every patient room, paintings that would provide comfort and distraction during difficult moments. Those paintings were nowhere to be seen. Either they had never been purchased, or someone had decided to pocket the money instead. As he sat waiting, Marcus could hear snippets of conversation from the hallway. Nurses discussing their weekend plans, someone complaining about being short-staffed, even though Marcus knew he had approved hiring for 10 additional nurses this quarter. Another voice, speaking in hushed tones about problem patients who couldn't pay. His hospital had become something he didn't recognize, and the responsibility for that weighed heavily on his shoulders. 20 minutes later, Dr. Harrison entered the room. The same Dr. Marcus had watched fawning over the well-dressed woman earlier. But now his demeanor was completely different. He didn't smile. He didn't make eye contact. He simply glanced at the chart, then at Marcus, with an expression that conveyed both boredom and mild annoyance. "So, you're having chest pains, Doctor," Harrison said, not bothering with introductions or pleasantries. He pulled out his stethoscope and listened to Marcus's heart for perhaps 10 seconds, barely long enough to count a few beats. "Sounds fine." Probably just indigestion or anxiety. Have you been under a lot of stress? Marcus played his role perfectly, explaining that yes, he had been stressed about finding work, about paying bills, about making ends meet. He described the chest pains in detail, mentioning that they were sharp and sometimes radiated down his arm. These were classic symptoms that should warrant further investigation, possibly an EKG or blood work. Any competent doctor would recognize the potential seriousness, but Dr. Harrison simply nodded dismissively. Look, you seem healthy enough. You're probably just working yourself up about your financial situation. I'd recommend some over-the-counter antacids and maybe trying to relax more. Job stress can manifest in physical symptoms. He was already moving toward the door, ready to conclude the examination after less than 5 minutes. "Doctor," Marcus said, maintaining his humble tone, "shouldn't we do some tests? An EKG, maybe? My father died of a heart attack at my age." And this was actually true. Marcus's father had died young from cardiac arrest, which was partly why Marcus had become so passionate about accessible healthcare. Dr. Harrison paused at the door, his hand on the handle, and turned back with barely concealed irritation. "Tests cost money, Mr. Johnson. Do you have any idea how much an EKG costs, or cardiac enzymes? We're talking hundreds of dollars here, and based on my examination, I don't think it's necessary. You don't have insurance, so you'd be paying out of pocket." He crossed his arms, his body language clearly communicating that he considered this conversation a waste of his time. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know the difference between a real cardiac event and stress-related symptoms. You're fine. Take some antacids, cut down on caffeine, and try to worry less about money. Ironically, that's probably what's causing your problems." Marcus felt a surge of anger so intense that he almost broke character right there. This doctor was dismissing potentially life-threatening symptoms simply because the patient couldn't pay for tests. This wasn't just bad medicine, it was dangerous, potentially fatal negligence. But Marcus forced himself to remain calm, to stay in character just a little longer. "Is there any way to get financial assistance for the tests?" Marcus asked, knowing full well that there was. He had personally established a fund that was supposed to cover exactly this type of situation, uninsured patients who needed diagnostic testing. Dr. Harrison let out an exasperated sigh. "You can talk to the billing department about payment plans, but honestly, I wouldn't waste your time. They're pretty strict about who qualifies for assistance. You'd need to prove severe financial hardship, fill out mountains of paperwork, and even then, you'd probably be denied. Just take my advice, buy some Tums and you'll be fine." He opened the door and stepped into the hallway, clearly considering the consultation over. "Sandra will give you your discharge papers. Try not to worry so much." And with that, Dr. Harrison walked away, already checking his phone, completely unaware that he had just failed a test much more important than any medical exam. Marcus sat on the examination table for a moment, processing everything he had witnessed. The callousness, the discrimination, the complete abandonment of the principles he had built this hospital on. He slowly got dressed, his mind already forming a plan. Tomorrow morning, there would be an emergency staff meeting, and by tomorrow afternoon, things were going to be very different at St. Michael's Hospital. Marcus left the hospital through the same automatic doors he had entered hours earlier, but everything felt different now. The cool evening air hit his face as he walked to the parking garage, where he had left his car. Not the Bentley he usually drove, but an old Honda he had borrowed from his groundskeeper specifically for this undercover mission. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying every interaction in his mind. The dismissive receptionist, the arrogant doctor, the invisible suffering of patients who were treated as burdens rather than human beings in need of care. This wasn't just about policy violations or customer service failures. This was about people's lives being put at risk because of their economic status. Marcus pulled out his phone and made a call to his head of security. "I need you to pull all the surveillance footage from St. Michael's Hospital for the past 6 months. he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Specifically the waiting room, reception area, and examination wings. I also need a full audit of the charitable fund disbursements and hiring records for the past 2 years. He paused, listening to the confused response on the other end. Just do it. I'll explain tomorrow. And one more thing, I need you to find out everything about Dr. Harrison and the receptionist Jennifer, employment history, complaints filed against them, everything. That night, Marcus barely slept. He sat in his home office, surrounded by the documents and reports his security team had sent over. The surveillance footage was particularly damning. He watched weeks' worth of interactions that followed the same pattern he had witnessed firsthand. Well-dressed patients received prompt, respectful care. Poor patients were made to wait, discouraged from seeking treatment, and rushed through examinations with minimal attention. But what made his blood run cold was the financial audit. The charitable fund he had established with $20 million of his own money was supposed to help thousands of uninsured patients each year. According to the records, only a fraction of that money was being used. Someone had been systematically denying assistance to eligible patients while the fund sat there, growing with interest. Marcus discovered that Jennifer, the receptionist, had been explicitly instructed by the hospital administrator to discourage uninsured patients from applying for assistance. The administrator, a man named Charles Brennan, whom Marcus had personally hired 5 years ago, had apparently decided that the fund should be preserved for truly desperate cases. But the criteria for truly desperate were so narrow that almost nobody qualified. Meanwhile, Brennan had given himself and several department heads substantial bonuses, justified by cost savings in charity care. Marcus felt sick to his stomach. His vision had been corrupted by greed and prejudice. As dawn broke over the city, Marcus made his decisions. He drafted a series of emails on his personal laptop, each one carefully worded and purposeful. The first was to the hospital's board of directors, requesting an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. sharp, no exceptions, no delays. The second was to his attorney, instructing her to prepare termination papers and severance packages. The third was to the local news station where he had a contact, suggesting they might want to send a reporter to St. Michael's Hospital later that day for a major announcement. Marcus then did something he hadn't done in years. He went to his closet and selected his most expensive suit, a charcoal grey Armani that had cost more than some people earned in a month. He paired it with his Rolex watch, his custom Italian leather shoes, and his platinum cufflinks. Today, he wouldn't be Marcus Johnson, the invisible poor patient. Today, he would be Marcus Wellington, Billionaire hospital owner, and people were going to remember why his name commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He looked at himself in the mirror, barely recognizing the well-groomed man staring back after yesterday's disguise. But it wasn't just his appearance that had changed. Something fundamental had shifted inside him. He had lost touch with his purpose, delegated too much, trusted the wrong people. That ended today. Marcus arrived at St. Michael's Hospital at 7:30 a.m., entering through the executive entrance that led directly to the administrative offices. The security guard did a double take, clearly not expecting to see the owner at this hour, or perhaps at all, since Marcus had been focusing on his other business ventures and hadn't visited in nearly 6 months. "Good morning, Mr. Wellington," the guard stammered. "We weren't expecting you, sir. Should I notify Mr. Brennan?" Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "No need. I'll surprise him." He took the elevator to the 5th floor, where the executive offices were located. The hallways were quiet, most staff not arriving until 8. He walked past his own office, which he noticed had a layer of dust on the nameplate, and headed directly to Charles Brennan's corner office. The door was locked, but Marcus had master keys to every room in the building. He let himself in and sat down in the guest chair facing the desk, settling in to wait. He looked around the office, noting the expensive artwork on the walls, artwork that seemed far too lavish for a hospital administrator's salary. A quick check of the signature on one painting confirmed his suspicion. It was an original piece worth at least $50,000. Marcus made a mental note to have his financial team audit Brennan's personal accounts as well. If his suspicions were correct, the corruption went even deeper than he had initially thought. At 7:55, Charles Brennan walked into his office, coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, completely absorbed in whatever he was reading on the screen. He was halfway to his desk before he noticed Marcus sitting there. The coffee cup slipped from his hand, splashing expensive espresso across the carpet. "Mr. Wellington!" Brennan exclaimed, his face going pale. We weren't expecting you. If I had known you were coming, I would have prepared a full report on our operations. We've been doing excellent work, sir. Efficiency is up, costs are down." Marcus held up a hand, silencing him. "Sit down, Charles." His voice was quiet, but something in the tone made Brennan immediately comply, sinking into his desk chair like a student called to the principal's office. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes locked on Brennan's face, watching for every micro-expression. "I want you to tell me about the charitable fund, the one I established 5 years ago with $20 million. How many patients have we helped this year?" Brennan's eyes darted nervously, his mind clearly racing to calculate what Marcus might already know. "Well, sir, we've been very judicious with those funds. We want to make sure they're available for the most severe cases, so we've implemented strict eligibility requirements. I believe we've assisted approximately 40 patients this year with various medical expenses." Marcus let the silence hang in the air for a moment. 40 patients. Out of a fund that should be helping thousands. Would you like to explain that to me, Charles? Brennan's face flushed red as he stumbled through an explanation about fiscal responsibility and long-term sustainability. He talked about economic uncertainty and the need to preserve resources, about how the hospital couldn't become a charity for everyone who walked through the doors. Marcus listened without interrupting, letting Brennan dig his own grave with every word. When the administrator finally ran out of justifications, Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and slid several printed pages across the desk. They were screenshots from the surveillance footage, time-stamped and annotated. Images of Jennifer turning away poor patients, images of Dr. Harrison spending 3 minutes with an uninsured patient while spending 30 minutes with an insured one. Images of people suffering in the waiting room, while others were fast-tracked based on their apparent wealth. "I was here yesterday, Charles," Marcus said softly. "I came in disguised as an uninsured patient. I experienced firsthand what you've allowed this hospital to become. Jennifer at the reception desk tried to send me away to a free clinic. Dr. Harrison dismissed my chest pain symptoms without running a single diagnostic test because I couldn't pay." He slid another document across the desk, the financial audit showing the bonuses Brennan had awarded himself. "While you were hoarding my charity fund and giving yourself bonuses for cost savings, you were putting people's lives at risk. You turned my hospital into a place that discriminates based on wealth. You betrayed everything this institution was built to represent." Brennan's face had gone from red to white, sweat beading on his forehead. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an apology or another excuse, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I've called an emergency board meeting for 8 a.m. You'll be there, and you'll explain to the board members exactly how you've managed the charitable fund. You'll also explain the bonuses you authorized for yourself and your management team, and then you'll clean out your office because you're fired. Effective immediately." Marcus stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with calm precision. "My attorney will be in touch about the severance package, which will be minimal, I assure you. And Charles, if I find any evidence that you've personally profited beyond those bonuses, if there's even a hint of embezzlement, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. That painting on your wall, for instance, the original Rothko. I'll be having an appraiser look at that, and you'll be explaining how a hospital administrator affords a $50,000 piece of art." Brennan slumped in his chair, all the arrogance and self-importance draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. "Mr. Wellington, please. I have a family. I made mistakes, but I can fix this. Give me another chance." Marcus paused at the door and looked back, his expression hard. "You had your chance. You had 5 years to do the right thing. Instead, you chose greed. Some mistakes don't deserve second chances." The board meeting was exactly as uncomfortable as Marcus had intended it to be. 8 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, confusion and concern written on their faces as they tried to understand why they had been summoned on such short notice. Marcus stood at the head of the table, a large screen behind him displaying the evidence he had compiled. He began by explaining his undercover visit, describing in vivid detail every humiliation and dismissal he had experienced. He showed them the surveillance footage, playing clip after clip of similar treatment meted out to other poor patients. He presented the financial audit, showing how the charitable fund had been essentially frozen while eligible patients were turned away. The room was silent, except for the occasional gasp or muttered curse from the board members. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a respected surgeon who had been on the board since the hospital's founding, had tears in her eyes. "Marcus, I had no idea. We approved the fund distribution policy that Brennan proposed, but he told us it was working as intended. He said we were helping hundreds of patients." Marcus nodded grimly. He lied, and he did it systematically, with reports that were deliberately misleading. But the responsibility doesn't just lie with him. We all failed. I failed by becoming too distant from the daily operations. You all failed by not conducting adequate oversight. Today, we start fixing it. Marcus outlined his action plan with the precision of a military operation. First, Charles Brennan would be terminated immediately, along with 2 department heads who had been complicit in the discrimination. Second, the charitable fund would be completely restructured with new, transparent criteria that actually helped people instead of excluding them. Third, every staff member would undergo mandatory retraining on the hospital's core values and patient rights, regardless of insurance status. Fourth, an independent patient advocate position would be created, someone who would work directly for Marcus and report any instances of discrimination or substandard care. Fifth, a portion of the charitable fund would be used to reach out to patients who had been turned away in the past year, offering them the care they should have received initially. Marcus also announced that he would be taking a much more active role in hospital operations, visiting regularly and even conducting additional undercover evaluations to ensure the changes were being implemented. "This hospital was built on a promise," Marcus said, his voice ringing with conviction. "A promise that every person, regardless of their bank account, would receive excellent care. We broke that promise, and people suffered because of it. Starting today, we keep that promise again, or we shut the doors forever. Those are the only 2 options." The board members nodded solemnly, several of them volunteering to take on additional oversight responsibilities. Dr. Reeves spoke up, her voice firm despite her earlier tears. "I'll lead the retraining program personally. And Marcus, thank you for having the courage to see the truth, even when it meant experiencing it yourself." By 10 a.m., word had spread through the hospital that something major was happening. Staff members whispered in corners, rumors flying about terminations and investigations. Marcus asked his security team to escort Charles Brennan from the building, a deliberately public walk of shame that sent a clear message to everyone watching. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He asked for Jennifer and Dr. Harrison to be brought to the main conference room. They arrived separately, both looking nervous and confused. Jennifer's hands shook as she sat down, clearly having heard about Brennan's firing. Dr. Harrison tried to maintain his usual confidence, but Marcus could see the worry in his eyes. Marcus sat across from them, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to tell you a story," he began. "Yesterday, a man came into this emergency room complaining of chest pains. He had no insurance, wore shabby clothes, and looked like he couldn't afford proper medical care. Jennifer, you tried to send him away to a free clinic. Dr. Harrison, you spent less than 5 minutes examining him and dismissed his potentially cardiac symptoms as stress and indigestion, refusing to order basic diagnostic tests. You both treated this man as if his life was worth less than someone with an insurance card. He paused, letting his words sink in. That man was me. I'm the owner of this hospital, and I came here in disguise to see if the complaints I've been receiving were true. They were worse than I imagined. Jennifer burst into tears immediately. Dr. Harrison's face went slack with shock. Today, you both have a choice, Marcus continued. You can clean out your desks and leave, or you can stay and become part of the solution. The silence in the conference room was suffocating. Jennifer's tears had left mascara streaks down her cheeks, and she looked down at her hands, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Dr. Harrison, meanwhile, seemed to be cycling through the stages of shock, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, watching both of them carefully. He wasn't interested in easy apologies or desperate excuses. What he wanted to see was genuine understanding of what they had done wrong. Let me be very clear about what happens next, Marcus said, his tone firm but not cruel. If you choose to stay, you will both be placed on probation for 6 months. Jennifer, you will undergo extensive customer service and patient rights training. Dr. Harrison, you will be required to complete ethics courses and work alongside our most compassionate doctors to relearn what it means to treat every patient with dignity. You will both meet monthly with the new patient advocate to discuss your progress. One single complaint about discrimination or substandard care based on a patient's economic status, and you're gone immediately. No second chances, no appeals. He let that sink in before continuing. If you choose to leave, I'll provide standard severance and we'll keep this quiet. Your professional reputations won't be damaged publicly, though I imagine word will spread regardless. So what's it going to be? Do you even understand why what you did was so wrong? Jennifer was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry, Mr. Wellington. I didn't think of it as discrimination. Mr. Brennan told us that we needed to manage the flow of patients, that people with insurance should be prioritized because they bring in revenue. He said the hospital would go bankrupt if we spent too much time on charity cases. She wiped her eyes, finally looking up at Marcus. I know that's not an excuse. I know I was wrong. When I became a hospital receptionist, I thought I'd be helping people, but somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing patients as people. I started seeing them as paperwork, as problems to process. The man with the construction injury yesterday, I didn't even ask his name. I didn't care about his broken rib. I just wanted him out of my line so I could deal with the easier cases. Her honesty was raw and painful to hear. Marcus could see genuine remorse in her eyes, but remorse alone wasn't enough. Do you understand that your actions could have killed someone? Marcus asked quietly. If I had actually been having a heart attack instead of faking symptoms, and you had sent me away to a free clinic that was understaffed and under-equipped, I could have died in that waiting room. That's not just bad customer service, Jennifer. That's negligent homicide waiting to happen. Jennifer nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I understand, and I want to stay. I want to fix this. I want to be the kind of person who actually helps people the way I always thought I would. Marcus turned his attention to Dr. Harrison, whose expression had shifted from shock to something that looked like defensive anger. The doctor's jaw was tight, his hands gripped on the armrests of his chair, and Marcus could practically see him building arguments in his mind. Dr. Harrison, Marcus prompted, what do you have to say? The doctor took a deep breath, and when he spoke, there was a bitter edge to his voice. With all due respect, Mr. Wellington, you don't understand the pressures we face in emergency medicine. We have limited time, limited resources, and unlimited demands. I have to make judgment calls every single day about who needs immediate attention and who can wait. Yes, I assessed your symptoms quickly yesterday, but that's because my professional judgment told me you weren't in immediate danger. I was right, wasn't I? You're fine. You were faking it. Marcus felt his anger flare, but kept his voice level. I was faking symptoms to test your response. But what about all the real patients you've rushed through? What about the people who actually needed those tests you refused to order? Your job isn't to make financial decisions about patient care. Your job is to practice medicine. Dr. Harrison's face reddened, and he leaned forward aggressively. You want to know the truth? Fine. I spend half my time dealing with people who come to the emergency room because they don't have a primary care doctor. They use us like a free clinic for colds and minor injuries that should be handled elsewhere. Meanwhile, I have actual emergencies to deal with. So yes, when someone comes in with vague symptoms and no insurance, I prioritize differently. That's not discrimination. That's triage. That's reality. Marcus stood up slowly, his full height and presence filling the room in a way that made Dr. Harrison shrink back slightly. Let me tell you about reality, doctor. The reality is that people without insurance avoid seeking medical care until their conditions become emergencies. They come to the ER because they have nowhere else to go. Your job, the job you took an oath to perform, is to care for them anyway, not to judge them, not to rush them out the door, not to decide that their lives are worth less because their bank accounts are smaller. He placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, his eyes boring into Dr. Harrison's. I watched you yesterday. I watched you spend 30 minutes with a woman who had seasonal allergies because she was well-dressed and insured. You laughed with her. You were patient and thorough. Then you spent less than 5 minutes with me, dismissed potentially serious symptoms, and walked away while checking your phone. That's not triage. That's prejudice. The fight seemed to drain out of Dr. Harrison as the weight of Marcus's words hit him. His shoulders slumped, and he looked down at his hands that had taken the Hippocratic oath to first do no harm. You're right, he finally said, his voice hollow. I've become exactly the kind of doctor I swore I'd never be. In medical school, I volunteered at free clinics. I believed in equal care for everyone. But 15 years of emergency medicine, of seeing the system fail people over and over, of being squeezed by administrators to see more patients in less time. I let it change me. I let it make me callous. He looked up at Marcus, and there was genuine pain in his eyes now. I want to stay. I want to remember why I became a doctor in the first place, but I need help. I need to relearn how to see patients as people instead of problems. I need to remember that every person who comes through those doors is someone's parent, someone's child, someone who matters. Marcus studied him for a long moment, searching for sincerity. What he saw was a broken man who had lost his way, but genuinely wanted to find it again. You'll both stay, Marcus decided, but understand this. I meant what I said about one strike and you're out. This hospital is changing, and you're going to be part of that change, or you're going to be left behind. After Jennifer and Dr. Harrison left the conference room, Marcus stood at the window, looking down at the hospital entrance below. He could see the steady stream of people coming and going, patients, visitors, staff, each one with their own story, their own struggles. His phone buzzed with a text from his PR director, informing him that the local news crew had arrived for the announcement he had promised. It was time to go public with what had happened, to take full responsibility for the hospital's failures, and to announce the changes he was implementing. Marcus straightened his tie and headed downstairs to the main lobby, where a makeshift press area had been set up. 3 camera crews were there, along with several print journalists. Hospital staff had gathered around the periphery, curious and nervous about what their boss was going to say. Marcus stepped up to the microphone, and the room fell silent. Good morning. My name is Marcus Wellington, and I'm the owner and founder of St. Michael's Hospital. I'm here today to tell you about a failure, my failure, and about how we're going to fix it. He paused, making eye contact with the cameras. Yesterday, I came to this hospital disguised as an uninsured patient. What I experienced was unacceptable. I was treated with disrespect, my symptoms were dismissed, and I was made to feel like a burden rather than a person in need of care. This is not what St. Michael's Hospital is supposed to be. Marcus went on to describe the systemic problems he had uncovered, carefully avoiding naming individual staff members, but being completely transparent about the failures in leadership, policy, and culture. He explained the charitable fund that had been underutilized, the discrimination that had become normalized, and the way poor patients had been systematically discouraged from seeking care. The journalists scribbled notes furiously, and Marcus could see the shock on the faces of many of his staff members. Some had been unaware of how bad things had gotten. As of today, we are implementing comprehensive reforms, Marcus continued. First, our charitable fund is being restructured to actually serve the community it was designed to help. Any uninsured patient who needs diagnostic tests, procedures, or treatment will have access to financial assistance with a streamlined application process. Second, we are creating an independent patient advocate position to ensure that every person who comes through our doors receives equal treatment. Third, every member of our staff, from reception to the executive suite, will undergo mandatory retraining on patient rights and our hospital's core values. He could see several staff members nodding approvingly, while others looked uncomfortable, probably those who knew they had been part of the problem. I also want to personally apologize to every patient who was turned away, rushed through treatment, or made to feel less than human because of their financial situation. You deserved better, and we failed you. A journalist raised her hand, and Marcus nodded for her to speak. Mr. Wellington, what consequences will there be for the staff members who engaged in this discriminatory behavior? Marcus had been expecting this question. Our hospital administrator has been terminated for his role in creating and enforcing policies that contradicted our mission. Other staff members are undergoing corrective action appropriate to their level of involvement. But I want to be clear, this wasn't just about a few bad actors. This was about a systemic culture that had drifted from our founding principles. I take personal responsibility for allowing that drift to happen by not being present enough in daily operations. That changes today. Another journalist spoke up. Are you concerned about legal action from patients who may have received substandard care? Marcus nodded gravely. If patients believe they were harmed by the care they received here, they have every right to pursue legal action. We will cooperate fully with any investigations. We're also proactively reaching out to patients we identified as having been turned away or undertreated, offering to provide the care they should have received initially, free of charge. A murmur went through the crowd. This was an unprecedented admission and offer. Marcus knew it would be expensive, possibly very expensive, but it was the right thing to do. We're also establishing a third-party hotline where current and former patients can report concerns or complaints anonymously. After the press conference ended, Marcus spent the rest of the day walking through the hospital, talking to staff at every level. He visited the emergency room, the surgical wings, the cafeteria, the maintenance department. He introduced himself to people who had been working in his hospital for years but had never met him. He asked questions about their challenges, their concerns, their ideas for improvement. What he heard was both heartening and troubling. Many staff members expressed relief that someone was finally addressing the problems they had been seeing. Nurses told him about being pressured to move uninsured patients through faster. Lab technicians talked about test orders being cancelled for financial reasons. Even the janitorial staff had stories about hearing patients crying in examination rooms, feeling abandoned and disrespected. But Marcus also heard stories of incredible compassion. Doctors who stayed late to make sure poor patients got proper care, nurses who paid for patients' prescriptions out of their own pockets, social workers who fought the system every day to help people access resources. These were the people who had kept the hospital's soul alive, even as its leadership had failed. These were the people Marcus needed to elevate and empower. As evening approached, Marcus found himself back in the emergency room waiting area, the same place where his undercover journey had begun just 24 hours earlier. The room looked the same, but somehow everything felt different now. Marcus noticed a familiar face in the waiting room, the construction worker with the broken rib from yesterday. The man was still there, or perhaps he had returned, still clutching his side in obvious pain. Marcus felt a surge of anger that this man had been left to suffer for so long. He walked directly to the reception desk, where Jennifer was working her shift. She saw him coming and immediately stood up, her expression anxious. "Mr. Wellington, Marcus held up a hand. "Jennifer, do you see that man over there? The one who was here yesterday with the possible broken rib?" She nodded, shame coloring her cheeks as she recognized him. "I want you to go over there, learn his name, apologize for how he was treated yesterday, and get him into an examination room immediately. I want a full set of X-rays, pain medication, and whatever treatment he needs. And I want you to personally make sure he qualifies for the charitable fund so his bills are covered. Can you do that?" Jennifer's eyes widened, and then she nodded firmly. "Yes, sir. Right away." Marcus watched as she walked over to the construction worker, saw her speaking to him with genuine warmth and concern, saw the man's surprised expression as he was helped to his feet and guided toward the examination rooms. It was a small moment, just one person being treated with the dignity they deserved. But it was also everything. It was the promise being kept, one patient at a time. And as Marcus stood there watching, he made a silent vow. He would never again let his hospital forget what it was built for. Never again would profit matter more than people. This was just the beginning. 1 week later, Marcus sat in his newly reopened office at the hospital, reviewing applications for the patient advocate position. He had received over 200 applications, many from people who had personal experiences with healthcare discrimination and wanted to make a difference. One application in particular caught his attention: Maria Santos, a former social worker who had lost her husband to a preventable condition because he had delayed seeking treatment due to lack of insurance. Her cover letter was powerful and personal, describing how her husband had ignored chest pains for 3 days, terrified of the medical bills, until he finally collapsed at work. By the time the ambulance brought him to the emergency room, it was too late. The heart attack had caused too much damage. Maria wrote that she had spent the last 5 years working with uninsured communities, helping them navigate the healthcare system, and she wanted to ensure that no one else lost a loved one the way she had. Marcus picked up his phone and called her immediately. "Ms. Santos, this is Marcus Wellington from St. Michael's Hospital. I've read your application, and I'd like to offer you the position of patient advocate, effective immediately." He could hear her gasp of surprise and emotion on the other end of the line. "When can you start?" 2 days later, Maria Santos walked into St. Michael's Hospital as its first independent patient advocate, and the culture began to shift even more dramatically. Maria proved to be exactly what the hospital needed: a fierce advocate with compassion in her heart and steel in her spine. She set up an office right off the main lobby with a large sign that read, "Patient Advocate. Free confidential assistance for all patients." Within hours of opening, she had her first visitor, an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had been coming to the hospital for diabetes treatment, but had been skipping appointments because she couldn't afford the co-pays. Maria sat with Dorothy for an hour, reviewing her financial situation, and helped her apply for the charitable fund assistance. Within 2 days, Dorothy's co-pays were completely covered, and she had a full appointment schedule to get her diabetes back under control. But Maria didn't stop there. She began making rounds through the hospital, introducing herself to patients, asking about their experiences, and identifying problems before they escalated. When she overheard a nurse pressuring an uninsured patient to leave against medical advice because the bed was needed for a paying patient, Maria intervened immediately. She pulled the nurse aside for a firm conversation about patient rights and hospital policy, then reported the incident to Marcus. The nurse was suspended for 3 days and required to complete additional ethics training. Word spread quickly among the staff. The patient advocate had real power, and discrimination would no longer be tolerated. Meanwhile, Dr. Harrison was going through his own transformation. Marcus had assigned him to shadow Dr. Patricia Reeves, the board member and surgeon who had volunteered to lead the retraining program. Patricia was known throughout the medical community as a physician who treated every patient like family, regardless of their background. On his first day shadowing her, Dr. Harrison watched her spend 45 minutes with an uninsured homeless man who had an infected wound on his foot. Patricia cleaned and dressed the wound herself, prescribed antibiotics that she knew the hospital's charitable fund would cover, and then spent an additional 20 minutes connecting the man with social services and a shelter that could help him stay off the streets while he healed. "Every patient has a story," Patricia told Dr. Harrison as they scrubbed out afterward. "That man's name is Robert. He's a veteran who fell on hard times after his wife died. He's someone's father, someone's friend. The infection in his foot could have killed him if it went septic, but he'd been avoiding the hospital because the last time he came here, someone, maybe you, maybe someone else, made him feel like he didn't deserve care." Dr. Harrison felt the words hit him like a physical blow. He remembered dismissing several homeless patients over the years, viewing them as frequent flyers who took up valuable time. He had never considered their humanity, their stories, their worth beyond their medical conditions. As the days turned into weeks, Dr. Harrison found himself genuinely changing. He started arriving at work an hour early to review patient charts more thoroughly. He began introducing himself to every patient with a handshake and direct eye contact, regardless of how they were dressed or whether they had insurance. One afternoon, a young woman came in with severe abdominal pain. She was clearly terrified and kept apologizing for not having insurance, saying she would leave if the tests were too expensive. The old Dr. Harrison would have done a cursory examination and sent her home with instructions to take ibuprofen. But the new Dr. Harrison saw the fear in her eyes and remembered Patricia's words about every patient having a story. He sat down next to her bed and asked gently, "What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Tell me about the pain, Sarah. Don't worry about the cost right now. Just tell me what's happening." Over the next 10 minutes, Sarah described symptoms that made Dr. Harrison suspect appendicitis. He ordered an immediate CT scan and blood work, then personally went to Maria Santos's office to fast-track the charitable fund approval. The scan confirmed his diagnosis: acute appendicitis that would have ruptured within hours if left untreated. Sarah was in surgery within 90 minutes, and her life was saved. When Dr. Harrison visited her in recovery, she was crying with relief and gratitude. "You saved my life," she said. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." That moment crystallized everything for Dr. Harrison. This was why he had become a doctor, not to process patients like widgets on an assembly line, but to save lives and ease suffering. He went home that night and called his wife, telling her about Sarah and about how close he had come to becoming someone he didn't recognize. "I almost lost myself," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I let the system turn me into someone who valued efficiency over empathy. But Marcus Wellington gave me a second chance, and I'm not going to waste it." His wife, who had been watching him grow increasingly bitter and distant over the years, heard hope in his voice for the first time in a long time. Meanwhile, Jennifer was having her own awakening. As part of her retraining, she was required to spend time in different departments to understand the patient journey from admission to discharge. She shadowed nurses, lab technicians, and even the financial counselors who helped patients navigate billing issues. What struck her most was working alongside the social workers who dealt with the most vulnerable patients: abuse victims, homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, terrified of seeking help. She met a mother who had brought her sick child to the emergency room despite being undocumented, risking deportation, because her maternal love was stronger than her fear. Jennifer held the woman's hand as the social worker explained that the child would receive full treatment regardless of immigration status, that no one would report her, that her baby mattered. Watching the relief flood the mother's face, Jennifer understood in her bones what Marcus had been trying to teach her. 3 months after Marcus's undercover investigation, St. Michael's Hospital had become nearly unrecognizable, not in its physical structure, but in its soul. The charitable fund had helped over 800 patients, more than the previous 3 years combined. Patient satisfaction scores had increased dramatically, particularly among uninsured and low-income patients. Staff morale had improved as well, with many employees expressing pride in working for an institution that lived up to its values. Marcus received letters daily from grateful patients, and he kept every single one in a special file in his office. But not everything was smooth sailing. Some staff members had resisted the changes, complaining that the new policies slowed down operations or created extra paperwork. 2 doctors and 5 nurses had quit rather than adapt to the new culture, insisting that Marcus's reforms were unrealistic and financially unsustainable. Marcus let them go without trying to convince them to stay. He knew that cultural change required not just new policies, but new people who embraced those policies. He hired replacements who shared his vision, conducting interviews personally to assess not just their medical skills, but their values and compassion. One of his new hires was a young doctor named James Chen, who had spent 2 years working with Doctors Without Borders in refugee camps. James brought an intensity of purpose and a deep commitment to equitable care that inspired everyone around him. Within weeks, he had become a leader among the staff, demonstrating that excellent medical care and compassionate treatment weren't mutually exclusive. They were inseparable. Marcus also made good on his promise to reach out to patients who had been failed by the hospital's previous culture. His team had identified over 300 patients who had been turned away, undertreated, or discouraged from seeking necessary care in the past year. Each one received a personal letter from Marcus, apologizing for their experience and offering free follow-up care to address any ongoing health issues. The response was overwhelming. Some patients were angry and distrustful, and Marcus understood why. He met personally with several of them, listening to their stories without defensiveness or excuses, simply acknowledging their pain and pledging to do better. Other patients were cautiously hopeful, willing to give the hospital another chance if the changes were real. And many patients were simply grateful that someone had finally acknowledged what they had experienced. One man, a mechanic named Frank, who had been sent away with chest pains similar to Marcus's fake symptoms, came back for the free cardiac workup that had been offered. The tests revealed significant blockages that required immediate bypass surgery. "You literally saved my life by apologizing to me," Frank told Marcus after his successful surgery. "If you hadn't reached out, I would never have come back. I would have just kept ignoring the pain until I dropped dead like my father did." Marcus gripped Frank's hand, his eyes bright with emotion. "I'm sorry we failed you the first time, but I'm grateful we got a second chance to make it right." As Marcus walked through the hospital on a Friday afternoon 6 months after his undercover visit, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The emergency room waiting area was busy but organized, with Jennifer greeting each patient by name and with genuine warmth. Maria Santos was conducting a workshop for new staff members on patient advocacy and cultural sensitivity. Dr. Harrison was in an examination room, and through the window, Marcus could see him sitting beside an elderly patient's bed, holding the man's hand and speaking with patient kindness. The transformation was real and measurable, but Marcus knew that the work was never truly finished. Maintaining a culture of compassionate care required constant vigilance, ongoing training, and leadership that never stopped prioritizing people over profit. He had established quarterly undercover evaluations, where mystery patients would visit the hospital to ensure standards remained high. He had also implemented a patient feedback system that went directly to his desk, ensuring he heard about problems immediately rather than allowing them to fester. Most importantly, Marcus had restructured his own life to make the hospital a priority again. He visited at least 3 times a week, attending staff meetings, eating in the cafeteria with nurses and orderlies, and making himself visible and accessible. His other business ventures were still successful, but St. Michael's Hospital was his legacy, and he wasn't going to let it drift away from its mission ever again. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected visitor, Charles Brennan, the former administrator he had fired 6 months earlier. Security called to ask if he should be allowed in, and after a moment's hesitation, Marcus agreed to see him. Brennan looked different, thinner, older somehow, without the arrogant polish that had once defined him. He sat across from Marcus's desk with hunched shoulders and tired eyes. "I'm not here to ask for my job back," Brennan said quietly. "I know I don't deserve that. I'm here to apologize. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what I did, about how I corrupted your vision for this place. I convinced myself I was being a good steward of resources, but really I was just protecting my own position and padding my own compensation. I turned human beings into numbers on a spreadsheet." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've been volunteering at a free clinic downtown, seeing the people who slip through the cracks, the ones who have nowhere else to turn. Every day I meet someone who could have been helped by the fund I was hoarding. I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what I did, and I'm sorry." Marcus studied the man before him, seeing genuine remorse that went far deeper than fear of consequences. "What are you doing now?" he asked. Brennan shrugged. "Working as an administrative assistant at the free clinic. It doesn't pay much, but it's honest work, helping people who need it. I'm also taking a course on ethical healthcare administration, trying to figure out who I want to be going forward." Marcus nodded slowly, then did something that surprised even himself. "The free clinic on 5th Street? When Brennan confirmed, Marcus continued, "I'm on the board of directors for their funding foundation. They're struggling financially, barely keeping their doors open." He pulled out his checkbook and wrote a check for $50,000, then slid it across the desk. "Give this to the clinic director. Tell her it's a donation from St. Michael's Hospital and that there will be more where that came from. We're establishing a partnership to ensure that people who come to our emergency room but need ongoing care at a lower-cost facility have somewhere to go." Brennan stared at the check in disbelief. "Why would you help me after what I did?" Marcus stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city beyond. "Because I learned something from this whole experience, Charles. I learned that people can change if they're given the opportunity and the motivation. Dr. Harrison is a different doctor now. Jennifer is a different person. And maybe you're different too. Maybe you've learned the same lesson I did, that our job isn't to guard resources like dragons hoarding gold. Our job is to heal people, help people, and trust that if we do that with integrity, the resources will follow." He turned back to Brennan. "Take the check. Do good work at the clinic, and maybe someday when you've proven that your change is real and lasting, we can talk about ways to collaborate further." As Brennan left the office, clutching the check with trembling hands, Marcus felt a sense of completion. The story that had begun with his undercover visit had come full circle, from discovering corruption to implementing change to offering redemption. This was what real transformation looked like. 9 months after the investigation, St. Michael's Hospital received an unexpected honor. The State Medical Board announced they were awarding the hospital their Excellence in Patient Care Award, specifically citing the dramatic improvements in equitable treatment and patient satisfaction. Marcus was invited to accept the award at a gala ceremony attended by healthcare leaders from across the state. As he stood at the podium in his tuxedo, looking out at the sea of faces, he decided to tell the truth rather than deliver a typical acceptance speech. "This award belongs to every patient who was brave enough to tell us we were failing them," Marcus began. "It belongs to the anonymous letter writers who refused to let discrimination continue in silence. And it belongs to the staff members who had the courage to change, to admit their mistakes, and to become better versions of themselves. He went on to tell the story of his undercover visit, leaving out names but not details, describing the humiliation and dismissal he had experienced. The room was utterly silent as he spoke. I stood in that waiting room wearing shabby clothes, and I became invisible. I learned what it feels like to be treated as less than human because of how much money is in your bank account. And I learned that unless you've experienced it yourself, it's very easy to convince yourself that you're providing good care while actually perpetuating a system that values some lives more than others. After the ceremony, Marcus was approached by several other hospital administrators, some praising his reforms and others looking skeptical. One CEO, a silver-haired man named Richard Thornton, who ran a competing hospital across town, pulled Marcus aside with a patronizing smile. "Very inspiring speech, Wellington. But let's be realistic. How long can you sustain this charitable approach? Healthcare is a business, and businesses need profits to survive. You're setting yourself up for financial collapse." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "Actually, Richard, our revenues are up 18% this year. Patient volume has increased dramatically because people know they'll be treated with dignity here. We've been featured in the media as a model of ethical care, which has attracted top medical talent and donor support. Our charitable fund has tripled in size because people want to contribute to an institution that actually helps people." He paused, letting that sink in. "Turns out that doing the right thing is also good business. People notice when you care about them, and they come back. They tell their friends, they donate, they leave positive reviews. Compassion isn't just morally right, it's strategically smart." Thornton's smile faded as he processed this information. Other administrators who had been listening looked thoughtful. Marcus knew that if even a few of them went back to their hospitals and started asking hard questions about their own practices, the ripple effect could change healthcare across the entire region. The following week, Marcus received a phone call that would lead to one of the most powerful moments of his journey. A woman named Lisa Martinez called asking to speak with him personally, saying it was about her brother Roberto, the construction worker with the broken rib, who had been one of the first people Marcus saw during his undercover visit. Marcus took the call immediately, and what Lisa told him made his blood run cold. Roberto had returned to St. Michael's Hospital 3 days ago with severe pneumonia. The broken rib that had gone untreated for so long had made breathing painful, causing him to take shallow breaths that eventually led to a lung infection. He was now in the ICU on a ventilator, fighting for his life. Lisa's voice broke as she explained that Roberto was uninsured and terrified about the medical bills, even as he struggled to breathe. "He keeps trying to tell the nurses he needs to leave, that he can't afford this, but he's too sick to leave. Mr. Wellington, my brother is dying because your hospital turned him away when he first came in with that broken rib." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. This was his worst fear realized, that the discrimination he had uncovered hadn't just been insulting or unfair, but actually deadly. "I'm coming to the hospital right now," Marcus said, already grabbing his keys. "And Lisa, I promise you, Roberto will receive every treatment he needs, and you will not receive a single bill." Marcus arrived at the ICU within 20 minutes, still wearing the casual clothes he'd had on at home. He found Lisa in the waiting room, a tired woman in her 40s, with worry etched deep into her face. She recognized him from the news coverage and stood up, her expression a mixture of hope and anger. "Is it true what they say, that you came here pretending to be poor and saw how they treat people like us?" Marcus nodded. "It's true, and I am so deeply sorry that we failed your brother. That failure may cost him his life, and I will have to live with that." Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "He's a good man, Mr. Wellington. He works hard, pays his taxes, helps our elderly mother. He just doesn't have health insurance because the construction company he works for cut benefits. That doesn't mean he deserves to die." Marcus gripped her hands. "You're absolutely right. Take me to him." They walked together to Roberto's room, where he lay surrounded by machines, a ventilator breathing for him. His face was grey and even unconscious. He looked like he was fighting with everything he had. Marcus stood at the bedside, looking down at this man whose suffering was a direct result of the culture Marcus had allowed to develop in his hospital. Dr. Harrison was Roberto's attending physician, and when he saw Marcus enter, his face went pale. He knew exactly who Roberto was and what had happened during his first visit. "Tell me his prognosis," Marcus said quietly. Dr. Harrison pulled up Roberto's chart on the tablet, his hands slightly shaking. "He came in 3 days ago with severe pneumonia. The infection is aggressive, likely made worse by the fact that his rib injury never healed properly and caused him to avoid deep breathing. We've got him on broad-spectrum antibiotics and the ventilator, but the next 48 hours are critical. He has about a 60% chance of survival." The doctor's voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Wellington, this is the man I turned away. I told him his broken rib would heal on its own. I didn't even order an X-ray. I did this to him." Marcus turned to face Dr. Harrison, seeing genuine anguish in the younger man's eyes. "Yes, you did. And now you're going to do everything in your power to save him. You're going to call in every specialist we have. You're going to treat him like he's your own brother. And if he survives, you're going to tell him what you did and why you'll never do it again." Dr. Harrison nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I promise. I swear to you, I will not let him die." Over the next 2 days, Dr. Harrison barely left the ICU. He monitored Roberto's vitals constantly, adjusted medications, consulted with pulmonologists and infectious disease specialists, and advocated for every possible intervention. Marcus watched the doctor transform his guilt into fierce determination, channeling his remorse into the best medical care he had ever provided. On the 3rd day, Roberto's fever broke. His oxygen levels began to improve. By the 4th day, they were able to reduce the ventilator support. And on the 5th day, Roberto opened his eyes. The first person he saw was Dr. Harrison, who had been dozing in a chair beside the bed after another all-night vigil. Roberto tried to speak, but the ventilator tube prevented it. Dr. Harrison immediately called for the respiratory therapist, and within an hour they were able to extubate him. Roberto's first words, spoken in a hoarse whisper, were, "How much is this going to cost?" "Doctor." Harrison had to turn away to compose himself before answering. "Nothing. Everything is covered. You just focus on getting better." Over the next few days, as Roberto's strength returned, Marcus visited him daily. He brought Lisa to every meeting, wanting her to hear everything directly. He explained who he was, what he had discovered during his undercover investigation, and how Roberto's case, both his initial dismissal and his current crisis, represented everything that had been wrong and everything that was now changing. Roberto listened in stunned silence, trying to process that the billionaire owner of the hospital was sitting at his bedside, taking personal responsibility for his suffering. "Why do you care so much?" Roberto finally asked. "You're rich. You could be anywhere. Why do you keep coming here?" Marcus thought carefully before answering. "Because my father died the way you almost did. He was a factory worker who didn't have good insurance. He ignored his heart symptoms because he was afraid of the bills. By the time he finally went to the hospital, it was too late. They tried everything, but he died anyway." Marcus's voice was heavy with old grief. "I built this hospital in his memory. I built it to be the kind of place that would have saved him, a place where people would never have to choose between their health and their financial survival. But I got distracted by other businesses, other priorities. I let people who didn't share that vision take over, and because of my negligence, you almost died, just like my father did." Roberto reached out and took Marcus's hand with surprising strength for someone who had just come off a ventilator. "But I didn't die. You saved me, and you're fixing the hospital. That has to count for something." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. "You're very generous, Roberto, more generous than I deserve." Lisa, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Mr. Wellington, There are thousands of people like Roberto out there. People who are avoiding doctors because they're scared of the bills. People who are dying because they don't think anyone cares about them. What you did here, changing this hospital, it matters. But it needs to be bigger. Marcus looked at her, seeing a passionate advocate in her eyes. What do you mean? Lisa leaned forward intently. I work at a community center in the East Side. I see people every day who need medical care but won't seek it. They need someone to help them navigate the system, to tell them about resources like your charitable fund, to advocate for them. Your patient advocate here at the hospital is doing amazing work, but there needs to be someone out in the community, building bridges. Marcus felt something click into place. Lisa was absolutely right. All the reforms he had implemented were reactive. They improved care for people who came to the hospital. But what about the people who never came because they had been turned away once or convinced themselves they didn't deserve care? Lisa, how would you like a job? Marcus asked. I want to create a community outreach program, connecting people to healthcare resources before they're in crisis. I need someone who understands the community, who can build trust with people who have been failed by the system. Would you be interested in running that program? Lisa's mouth fell open in shock. Are you serious? Yes, absolutely. Over the next month, Lisa and Maria Santos worked together to build a comprehensive outreach program. They set up offices in community centers, churches, and public libraries across the city. They trained community health workers who could do basic health screenings and connect people with resources. They created multilingual materials explaining the charitable fund and patient rights. Most importantly, they went out into the neighborhoods that had been most underserved, building relationships and trust one person at a time. Roberto's recovery became a powerful symbol of the hospital's transformation. Local news covered his story, interviewing him about his experience being turned away and then almost dying, and finally receiving life-saving care. The story resonated deeply with viewers, particularly those who had their own experiences of being dismissed by the healthcare system. Donations to the charitable fund poured in, with many people specifically mentioning Roberto's story as their inspiration. Roberto himself, once he was fully recovered, became a volunteer with Lisa's outreach program. He would visit construction sites, factories, and other workplaces, talking to workers about the importance of seeking medical care and sharing his own story as a cautionary tale. I almost died because I was too proud and too scared to keep pushing for help, he told audiences. I let one bad doctor's dismissal convince me that I didn't matter. Don't make the same mistake. Your life has value, regardless of what's in your bank account. His authenticity and working-class background gave him credibility that no polished spokesperson could match. Meanwhile, the hospital continued to evolve. Marcus established a teaching partnership with the local medical school, creating a program that emphasized equitable care and social determinants of health. Medical students would spend rotations at St. Michael's learning not just medicine, but compassion, not just diagnosis, but dignity. The program became so popular that applications to the medical school increased by 40%, with students specifically citing the partnership as a draw. 1 year after Marcus's undercover investigation, he organized an event that brought the entire journey full circle. He invited everyone who had been part of the story: Jennifer and Dr. Harrison, who had transformed their practices, Maria Santos and Lisa Martinez, who had become powerful advocates, Roberto, who had nearly died and now saved others, former patients who had been turned away and then welcomed back, staff members who had embraced the changes, and even Charles Brennan, who had continued his redemption arc at the free clinic. Marcus stood before them all in the hospital's conference center, looking at the faces of people who represented transformation, resilience, and hope. A year ago, I walked into this hospital in disguise because I had received complaints about how we treated poor patients. What I experienced was worse than I had imagined. I was dismissed, disrespected, and denied care. But what followed was something I never could have imagined, a complete transformation of this institution's culture. He gestured to the people around the room. Every person here has been part of that transformation. Some of you changed yourselves. Some of you were harmed and then found healing. Some of you took your pain and turned it into purpose. Together, we've proven that healthcare can be both excellent and equitable, that compassion and competence aren't opposites, but partners. Marcus paused, his voice growing emotional. My father died because he couldn't afford proper healthcare. Roberto almost died for the same reason. But because of what we've built here, countless others won't. That's legacy. That's what matters. And we're just getting started. After the celebration, Marcus received a call from the governor's office. The state was interested in using St. Michael's Hospital as a model for healthcare reform legislation. They wanted Marcus to testify before the state legislature about the changes he had implemented and their impact on both patient outcomes and hospital sustainability. Marcus agreed immediately, seeing it as an opportunity to expand the impact beyond his single institution. 2 weeks later, he stood before a packed legislative chamber, facing politicians, healthcare lobbyists, insurance company representatives, and advocates from across the state. The atmosphere was charged with tension. Some saw him as a visionary, others as a naive idealist who was threatening the established healthcare business model. Marcus didn't shy away from either characterization. I'm going to tell you something that the healthcare industry doesn't want to admit, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. We've been operating under a false dichotomy, the idea that we must choose between financial sustainability and compassionate care. That's simply not true. When you treat people with dignity, when you remove financial barriers to care, when you focus on prevention and early intervention rather than emergency crisis management, you don't just save lives, you save money. He proceeded to present detailed financial data from St. Michael's Hospital, showing how their reforms had actually improved their bottom line while dramatically increasing charitable care. The numbers were irrefutable. Marcus explained how the hospital's emergency room visits for preventable complications had decreased by 35% because the community outreach program was connecting people with primary care before they reached crisis points. He showed how patient satisfaction scores had led to increased donations and positive media coverage that attracted both patients and top medical talent. He demonstrated how transparency about the charitable fund had increased community trust and philanthropic support, tripling the fund's size through donations. When people believe in your mission, they invest in it, Marcus told the legislators. Our charitable fund started at $20 million. Today, it has $65 million, all from donations by people who saw that we genuinely care about serving the community regardless of ability to pay. But Marcus also didn't sugarcoat the challenges. He talked about the staff members who had quit rather than change their practices, about the difficult conversations and accountability measures that had been necessary, about the ongoing vigilance required to maintain the culture. This isn't easy work, he admitted. It requires leadership that prioritizes mission over margin, at least in the short term. It requires transparency and accountability. It requires hiring for values as much as skills. But it's not only possible, it's imperative. Healthcare is not a luxury good. It's a human right, and we can provide it equitably without bankrupting ourselves. The chamber erupted in applause from some sections and grumbling from others, but everyone was listening. During the question period, a state senator who was known for his conservative fiscal positions challenged Marcus. Mr. Wellington, you're a billionaire. You can afford to be generous with your own money, but how do you propose that hospitals without wealthy benefactors implement these reforms? Most hospitals operate on razor-thin margins as it is. Marcus had been expecting this question. Senator, first, let me be clear that the charitable fund's growth hasn't come primarily from my personal wealth. The majority has come from community donations, grants and creative partnerships with pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers who provide supplies at reduced costs in exchange for positive publicity. Second, my reforms weren't primarily about spending more money. They were about spending existing money more wisely and ethically. He pulled up a slide showing the administrative costs that had been cut, the executive bonuses that had been redirected to patient care, and the efficiency gains from reducing repeat emergency visits through better preventive care. The previous administrator was paying himself and his team excessive bonuses while hoarding a charitable fund that was meant to be used. That's not unusual in healthcare administration. When I audited our spending, I found millions of dollars that were being wasted on administrative bloat and executive compensation. Redirecting even a fraction of that to patient care made a massive difference. The senator looked uncomfortable, as did several healthcare executives in the audience. Marcus had just publicly called out the industry's dirty secret that executive enrichment often came at the expense of patient care. After his testimony, Marcus was approached by Dr. Evelyn Park, the state's health secretary. She was a no-nonsense physician-turned-administrator who had a reputation for tough reform efforts. "That was quite a performance, Wellington," she said with a slight smile. "You've made some powerful enemies in the insurance and hospital lobbying groups. You basically just accused them of profiteering at the expense of patients." Marcus shrugged. "I stated facts. If they're uncomfortable with those facts, maybe they should examine their business models." Dr. Park's smile widened. "I like you. How would you feel about serving on a state task force to develop healthcare equity standards? We're putting together a panel to create guidelines that all hospitals in the state would need to follow regarding uninsured patient care, charity fund management, and anti-discrimination policies. Your experience would be invaluable." Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'd be honored, but I want to include some of my staff on the task force as well. My patient advocate, my community outreach director, and one of the doctors who went through the transformation process. The people on the front lines have insights that administrators might miss." Dr. Park agreed immediately, recognizing the value of diverse perspectives. Over the next 6 months, the task force worked to develop comprehensive guidelines that would transform healthcare delivery across the state. It wasn't easy. There were intense debates, lobbying pressure, and political maneuvering, but the final result was a groundbreaking set of standards that would require all hospitals to establish transparent charitable care programs, patient advocacy services, and anti-discrimination policies. While Marcus was working at the state level, something remarkable was happening at St. Michael's Hospital. Dr. Harrison, who had transformed from a dismissive physician into a compassionate healer, was nominated for the hospital's annual Excellence in Patient Care Award, voted on by patients themselves. When the results were announced at the hospital's staff meeting, Dr. Harrison stood in stunned silence as his colleagues applauded. Marcus watched from the back of the room, feeling a swell of pride. Later, in his office, Dr. Harrison sat across from Marcus with tears in his eyes. "A year and a half ago, you caught me at my worst. You had every right to fire me, to destroy my career. Instead, you gave me a chance to become the doctor I always wanted to be. Patients are now voting for me as the best doctor in the hospital. I don't even recognize my old self." Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "You did the work, Michael. I just held up a mirror and showed you what you had become. You chose to change. That took courage and humility that many people don't have. You should be proud." Dr. Harrison shook his head. "I almost killed Roberto. I wake up some nights thinking about that, about how close he came to dying because of my negligence. That will haunt me forever." Marcus nodded slowly. "Good. Let it haunt you. Let it remind you why every patient matters, why every symptom deserves attention, why you can never allow yourself to slip back into treating people as less than human. Use that guilt as fuel to be better every single day. Jennifer, the receptionist who had tried to send Marcus away to a free clinic during his undercover visit, had undergone her own remarkable transformation. She had completed her probationary period with flying colors and had become a mentor to new reception staff, teaching them about patient rights and compassionate communication. But Jennifer wanted to do more. She enrolled in evening classes to become a licensed social worker, inspired by the work that Maria Santos and Lisa Martinez were doing. "I want to help people navigate the system," she told Marcus during one of his regular staff check-ins. "I want to be the person who opens doors instead of closing them. I spent years being a gatekeeper who kept vulnerable people out. Now, I want to be a bridge that brings them in." Marcus approved tuition reimbursement for her education and created a pathway for her to transition into a social work role once she earned her license. Jennifer's journey became a powerful story within the hospital, proof that people could fundamentally change their approach to their work when given the opportunity, training, and leadership support. 2 years after Marcus's undercover investigation, Jennifer earned her social work license and became a patient navigator, helping uninsured and underinsured patients access care, apply for assistance programs, and coordinate complex medical needs. Her personal experience of having been part of the problem gave her unique credibility and motivation to be part of the solution. The ripple effects of Marcus's reforms extended far beyond St. Michael's Hospital. Other hospitals in the region began implementing similar programs, partly because of the state guidelines, but also because they saw the positive publicity and financial sustainability that St. Michael's had achieved. Richard Thornton, the competing hospital CEO who had been skeptical of Marcus's approach at the awards ceremony, reached out to arrange a meeting. Marcus met him at a neutral coffee shop, curious about what had changed. "I owe you an apology," Thornton said, without preamble. "I thought you were being naive and reckless, but I've been watching your results, and I can't argue with the data. Your patient volumes are up, your satisfaction scores are through the roof, and you're actually profitable. Meanwhile, my hospital is struggling with retention, negative reviews, and declining revenues." He leaned forward intently. "I want to learn from you. I want to implement similar reforms at my hospital. Would you be willing to consult with us?" Marcus studied the other man, trying to determine if this was genuine or just competitive positioning. What he saw was humility and sincere interest in change. "I'll do better than consult," Marcus said. "I'll create an open-source toolkit that any hospital can use, templates for charitable fund management, patient advocacy programs, staff training curricula, community outreach strategies, everything we've developed at St. Michael's. I'll make it all freely available because this shouldn't be about competitive advantage. This should be about transforming healthcare for everyone." True to his word, Marcus assembled a team to document every aspect of St. Michael's transformation. They created comprehensive guides, training materials, policy templates, and implementation roadmaps. The toolkit was published online with a Creative Commons license, allowing any healthcare institution to use and adapt the materials freely. Within months, hospitals across the country were downloading the resources and reaching out to Marcus for advice. He found himself becoming an unlikely spokesperson for healthcare reform, speaking at medical conferences, appearing on news programs, and writing articles for healthcare journals. But Marcus never forgot where the journey had started, with him sitting in a waiting room wearing shabby clothes, experiencing discrimination firsthand. He shared that story at every speaking engagement, never sugarcoating his role in allowing the problems to develop or the privilege that had protected him from experiencing such treatment for most of his life. "I could walk out of that hospital, take off my disguise, and return to my comfortable life," Marcus would tell audiences. But millions of people live that experience every day with no escape. They are judged, dismissed, and denied care because of how they look or what's in their bank accounts. We must do better. We can do better. And the research shows that doing better is also good for business. There's no excuse anymore. His message resonated because it combined moral urgency with practical business sense, making it harder for healthcare executives to dismiss as naive idealism. 3 years after his undercover investigation, Marcus stood once again in the emergency room waiting area of St. Michael's Hospital. But this time, he wasn't in disguise. He was there for the dedication of a new wing, the Maria Santos Community Health Center, named after the patient advocate who had become a national leader in healthcare equity. The center provided primary care, dental services, mental health support, and social services all under one roof, specifically designed to serve uninsured and underinsured populations. Maria stood beside Marcus, tears streaming down her face as the ribbon was cut. "My husband died because he was afraid to seek help," she said in her dedication speech. "He was a proud man who didn't want to burden anyone, who thought his life wasn't worth the cost of medical tests. I've spent every day since his death trying to make sure no one else dies for that reason. This center is his legacy as much as mine. This is what's possible when we decide that every life has equal value." The crowd applauded, many of them wiping their own tears. Roberto was there with his sister Lisa, both now working full-time in the community outreach program. Dr. Harrison stood with his arm around his wife, who had never been prouder of the man he had become. Jennifer was there with her social work colleagues, already planning how they would integrate their services with the new center. Even Charles Brennan attended, standing quietly in the back, a reminder that redemption was possible for those willing to do the work. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd dispersed, Marcus found himself alone for a moment in the new center's waiting room. It was nothing like the cold, impersonal space he had sat in 3 years earlier. This room was filled with natural light, comfortable seating, artwork from local artists, and signs in multiple languages, welcoming everyone regardless of ability to pay. A quote was painted on the main wall, words that Marcus had chosen personally. "Every person who walks through these doors has infinite worth. We are honored to serve you." Marcus thought about his father, the factory worker who had died too young because he couldn't afford proper care. He thought about Roberto, who had almost repeated that tragedy. He thought about all the people whose stories would never be told, who had suffered and died in silence because the healthcare system had failed them. But he also thought about the thousands of people who had been helped by the reforms at St. Michael's, the dozens of other hospitals now implementing similar programs, and the state legislation that would protect patients across the region. Change was happening. One hospital, one patient, one transformed staff member at a time. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from his security director. "Another hospital CEO requesting a consultation about implementing our equity model. That's the 15th this month." Marcus smiled and typed back, "Schedule it and send them the toolkit." He took one last look around the center, then walked toward the exit. There was work to do, more hospitals to transform, more lives to save. The journey that had started with a disguise had become a movement, and Marcus Wellington had finally found the legacy he was meant to leave, not measured in dollars, but in dignity, not in profit margins, but in lives saved and suffering prevented. This was what it meant to truly succeed.